Every morning, before the sun had fully risen and before the city had remembered its noise, he walked the same road. The streetlights still flickered with their fading glow, casting tired reflections on the cracked pavement. The air carried a quiet cold, the kind that made people hide under blankets and postpone their responsibilities. But he never postponed his. He walked slowly, not because he was weak, but because he had learned patience. His shoes, worn and faded, carried the marks of years that had not been kind. Each crease, each scuff, told a story no one had asked to hear. People passed him without seeing him. Some walked faster when they noticed him. Others glanced briefly, then looked away, as if acknowledging his existence would somehow burden them. Their eyes always went first to his clothes, simple, clean but old. His jacket had been stitched more than once. His trousers no longer held their original color. To them, he was already defined. He was already understood, or so they believed. The city was a place where appearance spoke louder than truth, where fabric carried more authority than character, where people decided who mattered within seconds without knowing anything at all. He had learned this lesson long ago. Still, he continued walking, not with resentment, not with anger, but with quiet acceptance. He stopped briefly near a small bakery at the corner of the street. The smell of fresh bread escaped into the morning air, warm and inviting. Inside, customers stood in line, their polished shoes reflecting the clean tile floors. Their watches shimmered under the lights. Their lives appeared complete. He remained outside, not because he was not allowed inside, but because he had grown used to being outside. The glass window reflected his image back at him, but he did not linger on it. He did not question what he saw. He had stopped measuring himself through the eyes of others. Instead, he looked ahead. The world moved forward, whether people were ready or not. He continued walking until he reached the bus stop. It was always the same bus, always the same time, and always the same looks. When the bus arrived, its doors opened with a familiar mechanical sigh. People stepped in with confidence, with belonging. He followed quietly behind them, holding his small bag close to his side. There were empty seats, but none beside anyone willing to share space with him. This was something he had come to expect, so he stood, not because he had to, but because it was easier than watching people hesitate. The bus moved forward, carrying lives, filled with plans, ambitions, and destinations. People checked their phones, lost in worlds beyond the present moment. No one noticed him standing there, steady and silent. No one asked where he was going. No one wondered why he never seemed in a hurry. To them, he was just another invisible, part of the city, temporary, unimportant, replaceable. The bus eventually stopped near the tallest building on the street. It rose above everything else, its glass exterior reflecting the sky like a mirror. It was the kind of building that symbolized success, power, achievement. People entered with purpose. He entered quietly. Inside, the marble floors gleamed beneath the lights. The air smelled faintly of polish and perfume. Conversations echoed softly, filled with urgency and importance. He walked past them all. Some noticed him. Some frowned slightly. Some assumed he did not belong. Their assumptions were effortless, their conclusions immediate. He approached the elevator, standing among people whose clothes were sharper, whose posture carried confidence shaped by privilege. They avoided standing too close, leaving small spaces between themselves and him, invisible walls built from silent judgment. He noticed, but he did not react. He had long ago learned that dignity did not come from being acknowledged by others. It came from knowing yourself. The elevator doors opened and people stepped in. He followed. The ride upward was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of machinery and the weight of unspoken opinions. Floor after floor passed, lives separated by numbers. He stepped out on one of the highest floors. This was where he always got off. This was where his day always began. The hallway was wide and clean, lined with offices behind glass walls. Inside, people worked behind desks, surrounded by screens, papers, and responsibility. They barely noticed him. To them, he was simply someone who existed in the background, someone who did not belong to their world. He walked slowly, observing everything, with calm eyes, not with envy, not with regret, but with understanding. He knew something they did not. He knew that time had a way of revealing truth, that appearances, no matter how convincing, could never hold forever, that the world often misjudged people it did not understand, and that one day those judgments would face reality. He stopped near the end of the hallway, placing his small bag down beside him. For a moment he stood still, not tired, not defeated, just present. Outside the large windows, the city stretched endlessly, filled with lives intersecting in ways no one could predict. People below moved quickly, chasing things they believed would define them. Money, status, recognition. But he had already learned what truly defined a person. It was not what they wore. It was not what others believed about them. It was what they carried quietly when no one was watching. Behind him, footsteps passed, eyes glanced briefly, judgments formed and disappeared within seconds. No one asked his story. No one imagined it was worth knowing, and yet the truth of who he was stood quietly, waiting for the moment when assumptions would collapse, waiting for the moment when the world would be forced to see beyond clothes, waiting for the moment when everything would change. He picked up his bag again, his movements steady and certain. The day had only just begun, and no one, not a single person in that building, was prepared for what was coming next. The building woke slowly, like a giant stretching into awareness. Lights flickered on behind glass walls, computer screens glowed with artificial life, shoes echoed across polished floors, carrying urgency that had not yet found its purpose. Morning. Energy filled the air, disguised as ambition, and within it all, he remained exactly where he had always been, unnoticed. He moved down the hallway with calm familiarity, as though he had walked it 1,000 times before. His hands, steady and careful, reached for nothing, yet seemed ready for everything. The small bag he carried stayed close to him, not as a burden but as something quietly important. People passed him without slowing. Their eyes moved over him the way people look at furniture or walls. Something present, but not meaningful. Something permanent, but not important. Their judgments required no effort. His clothes had already told them everything they believed they needed to know. Some assumed he worked in maintenance. Some assumed he delivered packages. Some assumed he had no real place there at all. None of them asked, because asking required humility, and humility was something success often erased. At the far end of the floor, a group had gathered near the largest conference room. Their posture carried authority, their expression sharpened by responsibility. Their clothing reflected power, tailored and precise, chosen carefully to signal belonging. They represented the structure of the building, the visible hierarchy, the system everyone understood without explanation. They noticed him, only briefly. Their eyes carried the familiar mixture of dismissal and quiet discomfort, the kind reserved for people who disrupted expectations without meaning to. His presence did not fit the image of success they had built in their minds, and so they corrected the image by ignoring him. He continued walking, not faster, not slower, unaffected. His steps carried no insecurity, no need to prove anything. He did not carry himself like someone asking for permission to exist. He carried himself like someone who had already earned his place long ago. But no one recognized that confidence. because confidence, when dressed in simplicity, often went unnoticed. He stopped near a large window overlooking the city. From this height, the world below seemed small. Cars moved like quiet insects. People disappeared into patterns too distant to understand. It reminded him of something he had always known. Distance changes perspective. Things that seem important up close often lose their meaning when seen from afar, and things that seem small often carry the greatest weight. Behind him, the conference room filled quickly. Important discussions waited inside, decisions that would shape futures. Conversations filled with strategy, numbers, and predictions. He remained outside, not excluded, not invited, just present. Time passed in quiet observation. People entered and exited, their expressions shifting with pressure. Some carried confidence. Others carried uncertainty disguised as control. Their world moved quickly, driven by expectations they could not escape. And still, none of them saw him. Not truly. They saw his clothes. They saw his simplicity. They saw what they expected to see. Nothing more. Nothing deeper. Nothing real. A young employee passed by him, her steps hesitant, her eyes carrying the uncertainty of someone still trying to prove herself. For a moment, her gaze lingered on him longer than the others had. Not with judgment, but with curiosity. It was brief, almost unintentional, but it was different. He noticed, not because he needed acknowledgement, but because he had learned to recognize. The difference between judgment and awareness. Most people judged instantly. Few people observed carefully. She moved on quickly, pulled back into the rhythm of expectation. The building continued breathing around him. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, shoes echoed, lives unfolded without pause. Yet beneath the surface, something was shifting, something invisible, something inevitable. The truth had always been present, hidden in plain sight, waiting. He walked toward the center of the floor, his presence quiet, but steady. He passed offices filled with authority, past people who believed they understood power. None of them knew how close they stood to misunderstanding everything. None of them knew how fragile their assumptions truly were. Because assumptions feel strongest just before they break. He stopped near the large desk positioned at the heart of the floor. It was empty, but not abandoned. It carried presence even in stillness. It belonged to someone important, someone rarely seen, someone whose decision shaped everything within those walls. He stood there for a moment, not hesitant, not uncertain, simply waiting. Behind him, eyes began to notice, not clearly, not fully, but enough to question. His stillness did something unexpected. It disrupted expectation. People were used to movement from people like him, used to seeing them pass through spaces quickly, quietly, without claiming space. But he did not pass. He remained, and remaining required explanation. Some glanced at him again, their brows tightening slightly. Confusion replaced dismissal, not yet understanding, but beginning to wonder. The air itself seemed to pause. The building, so confident in its structure, did not yet realize it was standing on the edge of revelation. He adjusted his grip on the small bag, his movements calm, deliberate. There was no nervousness in him, no doubt, only certainty. The kind of certainty built from truth. The kind of certainty that did not depend on approval. He had walked this path long enough to know what came next. Truth did not announce itself loudly. It revealed itself quietly, and when it did, it changed everything. He looked around the floor one more time, at the people, at the structure, at the invisible lines separating status from humanity. He had seen these lines his entire life, seen how easily people confused appearance with worth, seen how quickly people decided who mattered, seen how wrong they often were. Soon they would see it too. not because he would force them, but because truth, once present, could not remain hidden forever. And in that moment, as quiet attention slowly gathered around him, the first cracks in their certainty had already begun to form. The moment of change had arrived. They just didn't realize it yet. Uncertainty has a presence. It moves through spaces silently, touching thoughts before people realize something has changed. It does not need sound to announce itself. It exists in hesitation, in longer glances, in the subtle tension that forms. When expectation meets something it cannot explain. That morning, uncertainty had entered the building, and it had entered with him. The floor that once ignored him now struggled to understand him. His stillness had disrupted the rhythm everyone depended on. People who once passed without seeing him now passed with quiet awareness, their minds searching for explanations their assumptions could not provide. He remained near the large desk. The desk that symbolized authority. The desk that few approached without permission. The desk that carried decisions affecting hundreds of lives. He did not touch it. He did not need to. His presence alone had already begun changing its meaning. Employees nearby pretended to focus on their work, but their attention drifted. Their eyes lifted briefly, then returned to their screens, only to rise again moments later. Their certainty had weakened, replaced by a question they could not yet form. Who was he? It was a simple question, but simplicity can be powerful, because it forces people to confront what they do not know. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the hallway. They carried urgency, but also something else. Something heavier. Something respectful. The building had learned to recognize those footsteps. They belonged to someone whose arrival mattered, someone whose presence shifted behavior instantly. Postures straightened, movements sharpened, conversations stopped before they fully formed. Respect, both genuine and rehearsed, filled the air. But the footsteps did not stop at the conference room. They did not stop at the offices of senior executives. They continued. Toward him. The employees noticed. Their confusion deepened. The footsteps slowed as they reached the center of the floor, and then they stopped completely. For a moment, nothing moved, nothing breathed, nothing existed except the silent collision between assumption and reality. Recognition passed across the face of the man who had approached him, not recognition built from appearance, but recognition built from truth. It was not hesitant, it was not uncertain, it was immediate, and it was real. The employees nearby felt it before they understood it. Respect had shifted direction, not toward the well-dressed, not toward the powerful-looking, but toward him. It was subtle, almost invisible, but undeniable. People sensed it in posture, in stillness, in attention. The invisible hierarchy they trusted had begun to rearrange itself, not through force, but through truth. He stood calmly, unchanged, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if this moment had always been inevitable, as if the truth had never needed validation, because it had never depended on clothing, it had never depended on opinion, it had always existed, waiting patiently for the moment people were ready to see it. Nearby, the young employee who had noticed him earlier now watched more carefully. Her uncertainty had turned into realization. She did not yet know his story, but she understood something deeper. She understood that they had been wrong. All of them. Wrong in ways they had never questioned. Wrong in ways that now felt impossible to ignore. The building itself seemed to hold its breath. This place, built on structure and status, had always believed it could identify importance instantly. It believed importance wore expensive clothes. It believed importance carried visible signals. It believed importance looked a certain way. But importance had been standing among them all along, and they had not seen it. Not because it was hidden, but because they had never truly looked. He reached down slowly and placed his small bag on the desk. The same desk no one dared approach casually. His movement was natural, effortless, familiar. It carried ownership, not intrusion, certainty, not hesitation, and in that moment, something inside everyone watching began to collapse. Their assumptions, their judgments, their confidence in appearances, all of it weakened under the weight of reality. People who had once dismissed him now struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Their minds searched for explanations that could protect their pride. But truth does not protect pride. Truth reveals reality, and reality does not negotiate with belief. He looked around the floor calmly, not with anger, not with triumph, but with quiet understanding. He had seen this moment before, not in this building, not with these people, but in countless other places. Places where people had decided his worth without knowing him. Places where appearance had replaced understanding. Places where judgment had come easily. He had learned long ago that truth did not rush. Truth waited, and when it arrived, it changed everything without raising its voice. The employees now watched him with new awareness. Their eyes no longer carried dismissal. They carried uncertainty, respect, and something deeper, regret, because they understood something painful. They understood that they had revealed more about themselves than they ever had about him. They had revealed their willingness to judge, their willingness to assume, their willingness to believe appearance over truth, and now they could not undo it. Distance they had created could not be erased instantly. Trust, once broken by judgment, required time to heal. He understood this. He did not expect anything from them. He did not need their approval. He had never depended on it. His worth had never been defined by their perception. It had been defined by something far stronger. Something they were only beginning to understand. Outside the windows, the city continued moving, unaware that inside this building something important had changed, not in structure, not in leadership, but in understanding, because truth had finally revealed itself, and nothing would ever feel the same again. But the greatest realization was still coming, the realization that would force them to confront not only who he was, but who they had been. Truth does not raise its voice. It does not demand attention. It simply stands still and waits for the world to catch up. And now, the world inside that building was finally catching up. The man stood behind the desk, his hands resting calmly on its polished surface. There was no change in his posture, no sudden transformation in his appearance. His clothes were still simple, his shoes were still worn, his presence was still quiet, and yet everything was different, because now they understood, not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to realize that everything they had believed just hours ago had been an illusion built on assumption. The floor that once ignored him now revolved around him, not because he had demanded it, but because truth had revealed it. People who had never seen him before now saw only him. Their thoughts raced, searching for fragments of memory, trying to recall every moment they had passed him without acknowledgement, every moment they had dismissed him, every moment they had decided he did not matter. Those moments now carried weight, because those moments could not be undone. The young employee who had noticed him earlier stood still, her understanding deeper than the others. She felt the quiet discomfort that comes when illusion dissolves. She realized that importance had never been absent. It had only been ignored. She understood something many never learn, that worth does not announce itself through appearance, it reveals itself through truth. The executives who once filled the conference room now hesitated at its door. Their authority, once unquestioned, now felt fragile. They had built their confidence on perception, on signals they believed defined success. But those signals had failed them. They had seen his clothes. They had missed his truth. And now, they were forced to confront something uncomfortable. They had not misjudged him. They had exposed themselves. They had exposed the limits of their understanding. The building itself seemed quieter, as if even its walls understood the significance of this moment. For years, this place had measured people by visible signs: titles, clothing, status. It had rewarded appearances that fit expectation and ignored those that did not. It had believed this system was reliable. But today, that belief had been broken. Because the man standing behind the desk had always belonged there, not temporarily, not by accident, but by right. Long before many of them had ever entered the building, he had shaped its foundation. Long before their careers had begun, his decisions had created opportunities they now benefited from. Long before they had learned to recognize success, he had defined it in ways they never understood. Yet he had chosen simplicity. He had chosen anonymity. He had chosen truth over appearance, not because he needed to prove anything, but because he understood something they did not. He understood that character reveals itself most clearly when no one is watching. He had walked among them, not as a test, but as a truth they had failed to see. Until now. He looked across the floor, his eyes calm and steady. There was no resentment in him, no anger, no desire for vindication, because he had never needed validation. His worth had never depended on their recognition. He had always known who he was, and that had been enough. The realization spread slowly through the room, settling into every mind, every thought, every memory. They remembered how they had avoided sitting near him, how they had refused to acknowledge him, how they had defined him without knowing him. Those memories now carried shame, not because he had punished them, but because truth had exposed them, and truth is the most powerful mirror. It shows people not who they pretend to be, but who they truly are. Outside, the city continued moving, unaware that inside one building, something far more important than business had taken place. A lesson had been learned, not written, not spoken, but felt. A lesson about judgment. A lesson about humility. A lesson about the quiet danger of assumptions. Because assumptions are easy. Understanding requires effort, and most people choose easy. He reached for his small bag one last time, holding it with the same quiet dignity he had carried all along. Nothing about him had changed, only their perception had. He began walking across the floor, past the same offices, past the same people, past the same walls that had once treated him as invisible. But now nothing about his presence could be ignored. They watched him, not because of his clothes, not because of his position, but because of the truth he represented, a truth they would never forget. He walked toward the elevator, his step steady, his posture unchanged. The doors opened as they always had, but this time the silence around him was different. It was not filled with dismissal. It was filled with respect, not the kind given to power, but the kind earned by truth. He stepped inside. The doors closed slowly, and as they did, every person on that floor stood with a new understanding they had not carried before. They understood that they had been wrong, not about his clothes, but about what clothes meant. They had believed appearance defined worth. They had believed simplicity meant weakness. They had believed importance announced itself loudly, but they had learned something greater, that the strongest people often walk quietly, that the greatest truth often wears the simplest form, and that the deepest value of a person is never found in what they wear, but in who they are when no one is looking. The elevator descended, carrying him away from their sight. But the lesson he left behind would remain forever, because from that day forward, they would never see anyone the same way again. And they would never forget the man they had judged by his clothes, only to discover that truth had been standing in front of them all along.